Well, coming from the perspective of a policymaker, first of all, we need to be sure when we talk about circular economy, we have to understand the landscape. If you look at ASEAN, the economies of ASEAN itself is very diverse. Membership of 10 countries. Yep. If you look at the total GDP of $3.7 trillion, a population of 680 million people, but each country is at a different stage of development. Therefore, when you introduce policies, you have to bear in mind that there will be countries that may not be ready to invest as much as others. If you look at Asia, it is driving the global economy. In fact, Asia's contribution to global GDP now has surpassed 50% and is forecasted to be, 58% by 2030. And where is that growth coming from? Asia and ASEAN. ASEAN is expected to grow 4 to 5%. So we talk about circular economy in this instant. There will be three areas where, as a policymaker, you need to factor in. One is in terms of capacity building, giving the right know-how, right knowledge, expertise. But to have that capacity building, you need resource, not in terms of time resource, but in terms of financing. So again, this has to come into play, whether we talk about is there enough financial support for this company to transition and to embrace circular economy. And the third, I think one must not forget that there is a cost to this. Is this cost going to be passed or transferred to consumers? If it is, will the consumer accept it? This is where, again, those government as policymakers, how do they come into play in these three areas? One, as I mentioned, capacity building. This is where government have to then encourage more of this so people can be aware as well and accept. If we look at today, when you walk into a coffee shop, if they serve you in paper cup or plastic straw, they say, I'm not going to go into the shop. So it's about awareness, right? It's about circular economy as well, in a way. Secondly, when you talk about financing, maybe government have to then encourage more resources in this area. Cheap financing or financing that are less burdensome for companies then to transition towards circular economy, because it is going to be costly. And third and final is when I talked about the importance of government coming in as a policymaker, where do we come in terms of fiscal and non-fiscal support? That's why I asked you just now whether you as a company getting that support, because if the demand side is not there, there will be difficulty. You can have all these plans, talk about companies or countries having the right framework. ASEAN has a framework on circular economy, was introduced in 2021. But at the end of the day, it is about implementation, the execution of those policies. They will take time, but I think it's inevitable that this focus towards circular economy is something that is paramount and definitely something that has to be done. Three things. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, ASEAN is very diverse, not just in terms of its economies, but in terms of level of development and the focus of industries. Malaysia, for example, as a country, we have moved into a more industrial base rather than agriculture. If you look at Malaysia's exports, for example, of total export, 80% of our export is actually from the manufacturing sector. Only 20% is agriculture. But in terms of carbon emissions, definitely one of the challenges will be to ensure that we do meet those standards. There are pressures in terms of regulation. You saw how advanced EU is already, and therefore they are ready to then implement some of the regulations that has been announced. One is EUDR, and Europe also have announced their CBA, the carbon border adjustment, which will then tax companies for market access if they don't comply to sustainability standards, which includes circular economy. So this is where I think when we talk about transition in all these ASEAN countries, we need to give them a roadmap. This is where I think companies have to fight for this, where that roadmap has its timeline, but the end of that roadmap, the journey, the destination, must be agreed by all. The most difficult thing to do is to take that first step. Yeah. And then we agree on the destination. The problem is that some countries have already started earlier in the journey, so they are ahead. Their destination can be at T plus 3 years left. We still have T plus 10 years, for example. But then the laws follow what they want. For us, your market access will be difficult. So that's number one. Number two, for Malaysia, I think many of the neighboring countries, we also need to have a framework amongst the ASEAN nations. This is where companies can play a role. Those are multinational, they are large companies. In terms of compliance, they have the resources, both financially and non-financially. I mentioned about capacity building just now. They can meet those standards because they have the resources. But in ASEAN, 97% of the economy is driven by SMEs. Do they have the resources? They don't. This is again some reality check to achieve that. Finally, investments have started. I mean, there's not all doom and gloom. For Malaysia, for example, we are here in Japan to talk to the Japanese company. We are much more advanced, definitely, by far, in many areas. So Malaysia also have some competitive advantage. As you know, Malaysia is an oil and gas country that has resource in oil and gas. But we have oil fields that are now no longer being used. So we can use that for CO2 storage. So that's why we're talking about carbon capture, utilization and storage. Storage is of a competitive advantage, but in terms of utilization and capture, is something that we're working on. And utilization is all about that circular economy. You mentioned about the burning of energy, the coal plant. I think we're working with Japanese technology to use ammonia to reduce the emission of CO2 by, well, now 5 to 10%, but the target is 45-50. But again, at what cost? You must remember it has to be commercially viable, and if it is not, someone has to bear that cost. If no one is going to bear that cost, it's not going to happen.
Okay.
Right. So I think those are the areas, and I think that's why it's quite complicated. But I think in ASEAN, when we have that discussion, we need to look at that framework. And next year, when Malaysia chair ASEAN, this is definitely one area that we are going to have a bit of focus on. We need to have, for example, standard harmonization and mutual recognition of circular products as well. So you need to come up with a framework. Maybe make it voluntary first, so that people understand it's about awareness, education, before you pull out the stick. But that's important. I think that's part of that journey. We have a long way to go. So therefore, we need to plan this properly. But if you try and make that journey, the destination arrive at the same time as the Europeans or the developed economies, then I think it's unfair, because we need to make sure that transition is equitable and it has to be fair. The other thing that you highlighted just now is about agriculture, right? Malaysia, Indonesia produce 98% of the palm oil. For example, we have our own standard, we call it MSPO, of course the global standard is RSPO, but they are looking at making sure that they comply with it. But the big companies are easier to comply, and the smaller companies is not. But I think in terms of awareness, the push towards that is important. Also because, as I mentioned earlier about the demand side, if market access dictates that you can only have access to these markets if you comply with the set of rules that they are putting on, then you have no choice, or else you will lose your ability to export or to sell or get access into those markets. So that's, I think, where it's important. In short, many companies are already embracing it. I mean, Petronas, of course, have also have the target. All the utility companies all have targets to meet. When it comes to circular economy, all the way to the net zero, everyone's embracing the Paris Agreement, the 17 SDGs. But whether the smaller companies, the SMEs even, can have the same kind of timeline is not easy. If I want to be very frank, the less developed countries will not have the ability to bear that cost, the LDCs. I mean, developing countries arguably can, but to what extent? There will be fiscal constraint. The developed countries will have more resources. They can bear the cost through their stronger fiscal position. Plus, they are the biggest carbon emitter anyway. For now, like you said, Asia is growing. So there are three groups that can bear the cost. One is, when I talk about fiscal, is basically the government ability to fund it. And how did the developed countries do it? And I can see that it's being successful in a way. And some ASEAN countries have started. I believe Singapore has started on carbon tax. By using the carbon tax, the proceeds they get from there will then be channeled towards subsidizing or incentivizing or giving grants for companies to then invest in this technology, which will then make it cheaper for them to pass this cost to consumers. And I agree with you, carbon tax is a way forward. From one perspective, I think one we can look at to do it in a tactical way. The concern is that tax will then also be passed through the consumers, because that carbon tax means they have to pay more, it again pays the consumer. So it becomes circular tax. And number two is people, the consumer. I think they also have to understand that this is higher cost, but in the long term, it will be a benefit. So you have to explain the long-term game. But it's not easy. People have very short-term targets. And in today's world, with the geopolitics, with the challenges that face, the cost of living is going up, a high interest rate, a high inflation, people are not thinking about long-term. But they have to share that cost. And the final one is the companies. I think everyone has to take some share of the cost of this transition of circular economy. And companies, to be fair, not all also can afford. But it has to be cost into a part of doing business with scale, and more companies do it, and then you are level playing field. And then that's again the use of the carbon tax, or else it's not going to be level playing field. Like say you invest, someone else don't invest, your cost is higher, but the others not, but they don't get punished. So I think a mixture of these three, there's no one group that have to take the cost. It has to be everyone sharing the cost. And that's why when we talk about economy, it has to be economy that's inclusive, economy that's equitable, economy that's resilient, then it's, of course, sustainable. In any policies that a government wants to implement, the main challenge is acceptance. I think companies, shareholders, consumers, all the stakeholders have to accept that at the end of the day, for us to continue to live in this world, to make sure that the planet continues to exist, we have to accept that circular economy is important. Because we can have any policies, it can be the best policy in the world when it comes to circular economy. If people don't accept, there will be no companies that are doing it, even with tough regulations. Because at the end of the day, in a democratic world, if people are not happy, they can change the government which support this policy. And you've seen it. Popular policies elects government. Difficult policy brings government down. The education is key for today. In the immediate term, we need to educate the people of the dangers of not embracing a circular economy.